going to try to get into the world of fine painting as quickly and simply as we can. If our highest purpose is to bring the painting to life, we must realize from the start that our study is light. No one has ever seen anything that was not illuminated. We paint more the weather and the time of day than the subject. Our study of light involves the world of infinite change out of doors and the beautiful silvery constancy of the north light in our wonderful North Light studio. Fine painters have revered the light that bounces off the north sky throughout the history of painting. It is a constant, silvery, subtle light that engulfs the whole figure, the still life, the whole room. We must relate this indoor light to the weather and the changing time of day out of doors in pitch and class of color. Fortunately, there is only one prism. We know that light falls toward shadow, from yellow to red to violet, from yellow to green to blue-green to violet. We know that all of the light is relatively gold. We know that all the shadow is relatively violet. We're constantly playing the positive against the negative, the major against the minor. We must have a language of light so that we can pitch the relative darknesses in our subject relative to each other. So we set up our palette according to the rainbow, light which exhibits the prismatic flow of light as well as anything else. We know that light falls toward shadow, from yellow to red to violet, as I said. So we will set up all of our tones so that we have a language of darkness, a language of light. We will start with cadmium yellow light, cadmium yellow medium, deep, 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 cadmium orange, red light, medium, deep, and deep, deep. Those 9 darknesses will prevail in every painting that we paint. The pitch of the different values in our light is 75% of painting. The color part of painting is relatively simple. But the values in painting, that's something else again. So most of our study is pitch. So that now we have a language of darkness. When we talk about the orange value, we're talking about the darkness of orange, not the color of orange. We can talk about the value of cadmium red deep. We know that's an accent. We can talk about the value of cadmium red light. We know that's yellow light. We know that's a highlight. Inside the studio, the walls and the ceiling preclude any influence that the sky might have on the shadows. In fact, the sky causes the light that bounces off the north sky and hits our subject. If we are doing a figure, immediately the light will turn gold. We select orange as a carrier of a strategic amount of yellow to paint the golden part of the flesh. And we lose that gold right into our light control, let's call it. Just, we mix up a gray, add a strategic darkness. Immediately, when we put the orange into that light control, the light in the picture has started. In order to get around the form, we must take the yellow out of the color, as the prism instructs us to do, and add either red or green as we approach the shadow. When we are painting the human figure, we're really painting the extent to which we can look through the skin and see the blood that's underneath. So we select cadmium red light as a carrier of a strategic amount of yellow and red to get rid of some of that yellow in our first tone. So by adding a little red light to it, we are overcoming the yellow and adding red. Immediately, the form begins to turn. Then we'll add a little more red to the third tone. And we will be going farther around the form. And we're approaching the shadow more closely. We'll do that once more. And we are beginning to get a progression of light, a prismatic progression of light. We're trying to live up to the prism and the rainbow. Finally, we approach the shadow. And we know that we have to lose still more yellow in order to turn the color and arrive at the form. So we'll select cadmium red medium deep as a carrier of still less yellow. And we know that will help us right in that strategic, elusive place that there are really nuances. They're floating all over, and you cannot quite put your finger on them. Half of the half tones will be on the cool side, the other half on the warm side. If we can't decide which one it is, then it's half and half. There's nothing else to do. Right, Kathy? That's right. Kathy agrees. Then we bump into the shadow. Since the sky cannot influence the indoor shadow, the nature of that shadow is warmer and darker than an outdoor shadow. So we select cobalt and cadmium red medium deep, not blue and not red. We're just looking for a neutral violet tone at a strategic darkness to mask in the general pattern of the shadow. So now, first of all, we'll mass in all of our shadow. And then after we have mixed all those tones for the light that started with the north sky, we'll select the darker red tone as the average light which will prevail. So we'll mask our portrait or figure in with one shadow and one light. There's no form when we are working with two planes. When you see two sides of a box, you're not sure that it's solid. The minute you see three sides of that box, it's solid. A triad, then, is a magical thing that suggests form at once. Now with our start, with one shadow mass and one light mass, the minute we put the warm transition or the cool transition in, and a halftone is just what it sounds like. It's half light and half shadow, pushed either towards the warm or the cool, the red or the green. We have a triad. You cannot stop the form from happening. It's really a magical thing, and it's amazing what limited means a fine painter uses to achieve his effect. Now in our start, we have one shadow, and we know that that shadow is flat, and that there cannot be any form in the shadow until we have a triad. So we'll start out with that average shadow. We call it puce because it's such a rotten looking color. And then we're going to go a step darker and get an accent. And then we're going to go a step lighter and get a reflected light. Triad, that magical thing again. The form will start in the shadow. Now that's not quite enough though. We don't have enough description in the shadow. We're going to go darker once more and lighter once more. That's all. That is limited means. Certainly we ought to be able to handle 5 planes in the shadow. Let's call them 5 necessary elements that must appear in the picture with their separate identity, with their characteristic distinction. All through this process of working in the shadow, we should have gotten rid of the background just as early as possible. Because rather than delineating things with outlines, there are no lines in painting at all. We'd rather cut the forms out. We'd rather start with generalities and carve them out just as if you were sculpting. So we need the background to do that. In starting ahead, we'd like to start with perfection, not the ins and outs of the specific head. We'll start with a general head, and gradually, by carving it out and building the form, we will arrive, hopefully, at a fine, strongly constructed head. Throughout this whole process, we're continually trying to perfect the transition, the halftone. The halftone is the name of the game. Every color is richest at the darkness of orange. When you go darker than orange, you're going away from richness into darkness. When you go lighter than orange, you're going away from richness into brightness. Obviously, if we want to have a colorful picture, we would have to pick a subject and a set of conditions that have a lot of values in the middle range of our palette. Now we begin to look at the light. And in the light we have stayed away from our highlights like poison. We must wait for the propitious moment. We must have laid a solid foundation upon which to build our form. And when the proper moment comes, in order that our whole form doesn't fall down like a building would fall down if it had no firm foundation, then is the time to consider coming up in the light. Now, we must have a dominant light. What does dominant mean? One. And we have a series of flesh tones that we planned in advance so that we know we will achieve that highest light and it will sparkle and have a great impact in the picture. So gradually then we'll decide where that highest light is going to be, and we will not dissipate that for anything. So gradually we'll crawl up and have a light that's slightly lighter than the average flesh tone that we started with. Then we'll have another light, and a third light, and a fourth light, and finally the dominant light. A shiver will go up your spine if you had to have exerted the restraint to achieve that marvelous, brilliant, startling, dominant light. There are very few paintings that you will ever look at that really achieve that. It takes a great painter to do that. But even if we try to do that, it shows. If you put on your lights too early in the game, you're going to dissipate your light and make it almost impossible to achieve a good halftone area. We can paint all kinds of different pictures. Some of our pictures, we want to be dramatic pictures. Therefore, we'd find a situation wherein there's a large area of shadow, a large area of middle tone, and a small area of light. But we're not in the business of knocking people's eyeballs out in every picture. We want to paint quiet pictures too. And the smaller amount of shadow there is, we're really getting towards flat light, with the light on the subject. The smaller amount of shadow, the quieter the picture is going to be. They're just as interesting, but not as dramatic. And finally we get down to a picture that has very little shadow at all. A huge area of middle tone, and then the highlights on top of the middle tone. That's the most difficult situation of all. That's usually the picture that the pretty ladies want to be, they want to be painted under those conditions. Because when they look in the mirror and put all that pretty stuff on, you know, especially in the eyes and all that stuff, there's all lights all over the place and they don't see any shadow on their face. So some of them are, in fact, very often, they're startled to see all this dark stuff on their face. But a painter's going to put it there anyway. And if you're nice to them and kid them around a little bit, they don't mind really in the end. All right. So now we've wound up with 5 planes in the light and 5 planes in the shadow. And 5 and 5 is 9. Obviously, painters aren't accountants, because the darkest halftone and the lightest reflected light are very close in value. So actually, we're only working with 9 things. But the character of the halftone and the reflected light are different, so we call it 10. The nature of a reflected light is a glow. Can be any color, any kind of a glow, depending on what the light bounced off of. The halftones are not as luminous, but they're very rich in color. They're both right in the middle of the palette. We talked a little about that. But certainly we ought to be able to learn to control 10 different distinctive elements, and we know how to mix them, and we know where to stick them, but it just takes a little bit of practice to stick them in the right places. A couple of years, like 35. I wish I had 35 years to go now, understanding what I do about it. There's no end to what you can understand, but if I could start with what I know now, I'd have a little head start in learning all that we have to learn. A painter is a little different than a musician. Those wonderful men who have such marvelous dexterity and understanding of music although they may have to practice just as hard as a painter, perhaps harder because it's a much more physical art, but they're usually giving their skilled interpretation of what other great composers have composed. Of course there are fine musicians who were also great composers, but most great composers were not fine musicians. A painter is both the composer and must execute his composition. Nobody can copy his picture, including himself. I just found that out when I had a print of my picture made. It's one funny thing when we think of these copies of Vermeer, and the museums were fooled, and the critics were fooled, and all the gallery people were fooled. You can't copy a Vermeer, and you could not make up one, because only Vermeer can do that. When you look at them knowing that they were false, there's no question about it. It's obvious. It's amazing the lack of understanding that the museum people and the critics have of the subject they deal with. As a matter of fact, in museums, they are slowly wiping off many of the greatest pieces of work that were ever created. There's hardly a Titian left in the world. And these so-called restorers take great glee when a Rembrandt appears to be getting brighter and brighter and brighter, and they just think it's getting wonderful. Actually, they're destroying it. They're wiping off all the halftones. Many Rembrandts have been destroyed. I know of one case specifically, my friend Frank Mason, he had a certain Rembrandt that was his favorite. It had a yellow sash. And every time he passed the Met, he'd run in there and take a look at it. One day he walked in, and the yellow sash was white. He stormed down to Rousseau's office, and he is a very theatrical person. And all hell broke loose at the Met, I'll tell you that. And Rousseau said, "Don't worry, Mr. Mason, we'll put it back." Imagine that. Rest. I just had a good suggestion. as we go into some of these principles a little more deeply, we're starting very simply, and we're going to try to get just as deeply into this subject as we can. We'll try to push it as far as we can push it. Now that we've resolved the problems of the figure, there are many other interesting things that we might think about. The flow of light down the figure from the dominant light, which is usually on the forehead, has sort of a flow, a rhythm, a structural rhythm as it goes through down the figure. The darks will follow. You will see the darkest darks as the light flows down the figure best. You're not attracted to the sides. You see the holes best, right where that flow of light is. So that makes your picture a little more dramatic, because that's the strategic place to put your darks. The shadow indoors does not get lighter or darker as it recedes into the room. But you're not looking in the background, or you're looking away from your subject. So that the darks on the sides of your picture are not perceived as well. So they are lighter. Most pictures that you look at, the painter didn't realize that. So usually the darks are just as dark to the right and the left as they are in the subject. Sargent could paint a room full of fancy furniture and pictures on the walls and draperies and everything. Wouldn't detract from his subject at all, because he didn't put his accents at the extremities of the picture. He kept all of the attention in his subject. We want our pictures to be simple, powerful, direct, and simplicity does not necessarily stem from eliminating detail. We arrive at that simplicity from a simple number of planes of light and shadow. 5. You tend to reduce to a triad as you go away from your subject. And the accents are not there. So you're painting in a closer world of air and space and light. That's all the background should be. Air and space and light around your subject, so that your subject can live and breathe. If we're painting a still life, we're not painting the flowers. We're painting the light on the flowers. We're painting the impression of the flowers. All fine painters were impressionists. Not the silly word that the writers and the critics and the dealers give to the so-called impressionists. An impression is a person who paints the abstract light effect. The general effect of light is more convincing than any inventory of the subject could ever be, no matter how perfectly the inventory is. That impression, that abstraction, is the supreme part of painting. Rembrandt was an impressionist. Velasquez, if you want to be really silly about it, understood these things a hair better than Rembrandt. Isn't that silly? Then all the other painters stepped down from them. and we admire so many of them. Van Dyck, Vermeer, Rayburn, I think he is the most underrated painter. Just marvelous, simple planes of light and shadow. 5 in the shadow, 5 in the light. We can see it in Rayburn clearly. You can practically see his strokes. In Rembrandt, it's a little harder to see because he was a little devious. He had to be, because he didn't have the paint to paint directly. He had to resort to all manner of means and glazes and trickery almost to achieve his effect. And it must be said he achieved some effects that no other painter ever came close to. Velázquez achieved it much more directly, with much less glazing. So we look at a Rembrandt, and we admire the daylights out of it, but we don't know exactly how he did it. Nobody ever will. They think they do, but they don't. We don't have to be indirect. We have the paint, that range, that 1 octave between white and black. We can paint a la prima, much more directly. I feel that if we have to resort to glazing, we're just correcting something that we should have done in the first place. Let's go back to the still life. This bouquet of flowers. We're not painting the flowers, we're painting the volume of the bouquet. Just as when we paint a portrait, we're not painting the features, we're painting the volume and the structure and the character of the head. People think that the likeness is the features. It is not. It's the general shape of the head. The features are sort of window dressing. Sargent said that a painting is something where there's always something wrong with the mouth. No, that's not true. When there's something wrong with the portrait, it's not the eyes or the nose or the mouth, it's the whole damn head. One thing that you can do after you've tried to paint a portrait and the people say, oh, the glint in the eyes isn't quite there. We'll say, okay, I'll fix that. So you just take that portrait home and don't touch it. And bring it back the next day and they'll say, oh, much better. I'm trying to think of some more observations to make about the indoor light. If you'd like to ask any questions, I'd be glad to try to delve into your problem.
Vis-a-vis light indoors, how about reflected light? Does it depend what is reflected off and so on?
The reflected light can be bouncing off any colored object, and a light object or a half-light object. It can have a very powerful influence. Suppose you have a white shirt on. That'll send a tremendous glow underneath the chin. Those 2 planes of reflected light that we were talking about, usually there's an influence from the room in general on the upright plane and a stronger influence on the underplanes, even as far up as underneath the eyebrow, strongest underneath the chin and the jawbone. If you have a black shirt on, there's no reflection here. If it's a figure, there's a nice warm glow here. The white shirt, a little more light and a little less colorful. So you're just waiting around for any influence at all to throw in that shadow. And we must get rid of that shadow control that we started with We're starting with the principle, not the color of the shadow. We're almost starting with the law of physics. There are only two things that are going to get rid of that color that we put in that shadow. That is the local color, the red lips, the green hair, blue thing, brown thing, anything, and the reflected light. That's all. One good way of making a reflected light is to get a gray, just a little bit lighter than the shadow. Throw in whatever influence you think is going into the shadow, and sometimes you're not sure, so look around and see what's causing it. Throw that into the gray first and throw it in. Just keep in mind that the reflected lights are darker than the lights. And the minute you touch a flesh tone into that shadow, you lost your shadow, and all is lost. The shadow and the light are inviolate. They must be held as two separate entities. In other words, the simple idea of massing is the most important thing that we can do. If you don't achieve the unity of the shadow and the unity of the light, nothing's going to happen. Period. We can say that the oneness of the shadow is more important than the differences inside it. And the unity of light is just the same. The minute we make the modeling in the light, do that with too many values, and have our halftones too dark, we call that over-modeling. We've broken up our light mass. And those two separate identities are pulled together by the halftone. All fine painters were concerned with that and achieved that. A few painters achieve that every now and then by accident, but a fine painter does it every time. Pounded the table for that one. Okay, Anna? Does that clear that up a little bit?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Can I ask another question?
Sure.
I don't want to hog the
No
podium here,
no
but
problem.
do you distinguish between your grays made of, say, complementary colors and ones made from just black and white?
We do not take a law of physics and make it a way of painting. Everything that we do is complementary, but we do not paint with complementary colors. That is a formula. And we work with big general principles that cannot change because it's a natural law. But we are changing our effect all the time. And by the simple means of using complementary colors, we're going to sort of being painting the same picture every time, which is exactly what those people do. They do not get the variety. They cannot change the class of color by using the complementary principle as a formula. We're aware of that law, that law of physics, and it is in our thinking all the time, but we don't make it a formula. We're playing the violet against the gold, positive against the negative. It's almost a cheap device. You see so many painters, if they have something blue around, they're looking for something orange because they think that jazzes up the picture. No, it doesn't. If there's something red around, they put something green there. It's not there. We let nature tell us what to do. No formula would ever correctly describe the effects in nature, because we're dealing with a world of infinite change, and we want our thinking to be ready to make those changes. Okay? It's like those, so many painters claim that if you use black, you will ruin your color. Every fine painter in the history of painting that achieved brilliant color used black. The painters who espouse just using pure colors end up with color all over their pictures, and they wind up with nothing. Because it takes an awful lot of negative to offset the positive. And some of the most colorful, luminous, glowing pictures have very little color in them. In fact, there's no such thing as color for its own sake. Color is a phenomenon of light. What's the difference between a red rose and a yellow rose? It's just the different pigmentation of the two roses. That when the light illuminates them, the yellow rose absorbs a lot of the red and the blue and reflects the yellow of the spectrum. The red rose absorbs some of the yellow and most of the blue and reflects the red. Do you think there's any color in the pigment when it's in the tube? It's just so much matter. But the minute you open the top, the color's there because it was illuminated. I've tried many times to get the top off quick enough but you can't do that. Anything more, Bill?
When you're new at it as I am, you don't know what to ask.
Well, I'm new at it too. How about going out of doors? Out of doors, that wonderful world of change brings up the true excitement of painting. Because the weather and the time of day makes for sure that effect, that wonderful light effect we want to paint, is going to be changing and changing and changing. Because there are no walls or ceilings, the outdoor sky pours into the outdoor shadows, and they are just sitting there, waiting for them to reflect into them. And the sky carries a cooling influence, of course, and also some white light with it. So the nature of an outdoor shadow is lighter and cooler than an indoor shadow. It's just as violet, but it's a different family of violets. It's a cooler, neutral violet. So we search around for an outdoor shadow control, and we think that the best thing that we can find is Payne's gray. That's half gray and half blue. We put the blue and the gray together, and we have the two influences that are affecting the outdoor shadow. The sky and the atmosphere. Unlike the indoor shadow, the outdoor shadow gets lighter and loses its color rapidly as it recedes into the distance. we have Payne's gray at all those values of the cadmiums, the same range of darknesses from yellow light to cadmium red deep, deep. And I'm trying to figure out the best way of explaining what's going on. I think we better start with the whole concept of an average sunny day. If we're going to make all of those changes consistently to each other, we must have a set of basic assumptions. On an average sunny day, we say that the average of the upright plane in the shadow, in the foreground, will be cadmium red medium. And we can mass that in with Payne's gray, half blue and half gray, at cadmium red medium, and be pretty sure that we're going to be pitched well. You say, how do you know that? Because we pitched it darker, and our shadows will deny the light in the sky. We pitched it lighter, and there isn't enough contrast between the light and the shadow. We know there's got to be a place in there, someplace, that is strategic on an average sunny day. And we think that that's it, because we tried everything else. Inside the shadow, we know we need a triad. So on the flat plane, the sky comes down carrying white light a little more strongly. We're going to go a step lighter to cadmium red light, Payne's gray. Half blue and half gray, half atmosphere and half sky. Two planes, no form. Then we're going to have an underplane. We'll go to cadmium red deep, triad form. The foliage is already suggested. Now we're not painting leaves. We're going to suggest that the leaves are there. And boy, you put that triad in there and you create big structural rhythms. The way the dark underplanes wrap themselves around the tree in circles, or an S, or a question mark, any structural rhythm that wraps itself around that tree will create the structure of that tree. Just like in a head, in the composition of the figure, we're looking for big structural rhythms. In a floral still life, we're looking for the way those shadow shapes roll around that figure and constructing anything. We're trying to think of where this shape comes from and where it's going as it wraps itself around and describes the form. That's the dynamics of a painting. When you just delineate the object, it's going to be static. But when you find those wonderful structural rhythms that wrap themselves around and go around behind and come out the other side, it's going to make your painting exciting and your structure moving and convincing. We have to make our trees just as convincing as our figures. There's an awful lot of spinach out there, though, and it's not easy to paint the foliage without painting the leaves. Of course, you paint a couple of leaves in there, just, fewer the better. So we're going to try to put these patterns wrapping around our beautiful trees and foliage in rhythms so that they're interesting and moving. And each different kind of a tree has a different characteristic rhythm, the way it's constructed. And each tree in the same species is different. Nature exhibits infinite variety. Even fir trees are all different, every one. Just like we're all different.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You're talking about this triad in outdoor shadows of the Payne's grade and one of the cadmiums. That's irrespective of whatever object happens to be in the shadow?
Certainly not. Nature exhibits infinite variety. This idea of the average sunny day implies that everything we're saying is on the average. In other words, there could be a whole line of willow trees and you change your pitch a little bit. There could be a whole line of fir trees and you change your pitch a little bit. But on the average, in the whole green world in general, that's it.
I'm talking about if it's on, let's say, foliage as opposed to rock, would you get into, say, a value of green?
We come up with a different instance every time. I'm talking mainly of the green landscape. If the rocks are wet, you've got a different pitch. If they're dry, you've got a different pitch. But we're ready to make every single change. We said we're dealing with infinite change. But we want to set the average pitch on an average sunny day. And unless we get that in our minds, we're not ready to make those changes. We're ready to go off in any direction, infinitely. A painter deals with millions of different kinds of surfaces that reflect and absorb the light in different ways, and they absorb them differently when they're wet. And a painter just makes this fantastic generalization in order to make the most convincing painting possible. In fact, those differences are what we're looking for. That is what the solution of all those differences is what makes the painting convincing. We're just trying to set our pitch in general so that we're out of doors. We're ready to change right from those basic assumptions. We know we're in a thoughtfully different key than we are inside the studio. Because at all costs, we want our outdoor paintings to stay outside. We want our paintings inside the studio to stay inside. QED, right? So we've got the foliage started, and that isn't enough. Try it. You haven't described, you don't see the leaves floating around and all that. So we're going to go lighter once more in the shadow. On any top plane or flat plane that goes away from underneath the trees, the sky will come down a little stronger. Top plane of a white rock, top of a white shirt, anything white reflects the sky more clearly than anything else. So we're going to have two top planes, one lighter than the other. And then we have a little bit of paucity in our accent, so we're going to go darker once more and dig a deeper hole. 5 planes. That's it. You start using 7 planes in your foliage and it looks like you're taking an inventory. And how can you do that unless you count the leaves first? Kathy's the only one who can do that. Right? It's a marvelous, wonderful, creative thing. This idea of abstracting all that spinach and getting a more convincing impression almost than nature itself. That's getting pretty creative. You can't copy nature. A fine painter does not paint what he sees. An unfortunate painter paints what he sees, because he doesn't see beyond his eyes. We do our level best to paint with our insight into the nature of things. And those observations are the province only of fine painters. And there have been so few of them. In any century, you don't need two hands to count the truly fine painters. Right now, I don't even think you need one. Wouldn't it be great if we could be one of them? We won't be, but it sure is a heck of a lot of fun trying. And even if you're trying, it shows that you're trying. You have to feel sorry for the guys who don't know enough about it to try. If they did, they'd sure as hell try.
Arthur, who are the three great artists you're referring to? Three that you named.
Now, I'd hesitate to say. I know a couple I think are close. Sometimes I think so, and sometimes I don't.
I should. I said I might yet. Check it out at the Coles later.
American?
Yeah. Best painters are American today. Isn't that something? The best painters in Paris are Americans. Best painters in Rome are Americans. With all their heritage and tradition, they've all thrown it right out the window and they're all like Picasso. Americans go and appreciate their heritage, the European heritage, much more than they do. Well, we've got set the pitch of the foreground shadows on an average sunny day. Let's talk a little bit more about that. We're looking right at the upright plane. This is true inside the studio as well. That's the color plane. You're looking right at it. So your color is going to be richest on the upright plane. The flat plane, as it approaches the foreground, that's rich too, but not as rich as the upright. It sort of is neutralized a little bit by the influence of the sky. The underplane is a little bit warmer because the reflection of the sky, when it comes down, can't turn a corner and go into the hole. So there we have quite an interesting warm and cool effect. The cool on the top plane and the warm on the underplane. Color on the upright plane. Okay, in the light, the sunlight on an average sunny day, we say that the average darkness of the flat plane in sunlight is cadmium yellow deep. Say, how do you know that? Because we pitched it a step darker, and it begins to look like a gray day. And we've pitched it a step lighter, and it looks like the earth doesn't silhouette against the sky. So again, we know there's a place in there, someplace, that is a strategic darkness for the middle position of sunlight, the average of all the sunlight going back. The light sunlight, the dark sunlight, and the middle sunlight. So we can progress our landscape with that average and be very confident it'll be compatible with the way we pitched our shadow. But the earth undulates. There'd be no form with one plane. So we gotta have a top plane and a side plane triad. Immediately you can suggest that the earth is undulating. You can paint hummocks and this and that, whatever you want. Can we say that's not enough? Gonna go still lighter on a top plane. Still darker as the plane is turning around toward shadow. 5 planes. That's all. We're not counting the white rocks or the white shirt or the white house or a glint in the water or foam. That's out, that's the average. That's out of the whole concept of the average. In fact, if we don't pitch our landscape in just such a way that I'm describing, you can't paint the white rocks. You would have dissipated your light. Just like we keep our flesh tones down in a position so that we can have the highlight and have enough left to paint a white shirt, a highlight on an earring. We want our landscapes to be filled with sparkling light. The only way to achieve that is through pitch. Again, pitch is 75% painting. We have to say that a landscape is as good as its progression. We've said that the shadows progress into the distance rapidly, getting lighter, and losing its color rapidly into the influence of the sky and the atmosphere. There's a place in the outdoor shadow that we call the neutralization point, where all the color has left the shadow and it will be at the darkness of orange, and nothing will be left but the sky and the atmosphere, Payne's gray. Sometimes with a little red in it, sometimes with a little orange in it. There are days we call them red days, and orange days, or this, or that. They change just a little bit, but in the main it's just Payne's gray. The color's gone. On a muggy day, the neutralization point will be closer because the obstruction in the air, the particles of moisture between you and what you're looking at, increases. And it just covers over the shadow very rapidly on a muggy day. The clearer the day gets, the less atmosphere there is, and the farther you can see the darkness of the shadows. On a bright, clear day, the shadows on the mountains, you can perceive them much more clearly than when it's muggy. So it's a pretty good idea when you're painting a picture to decide right at the start just where the neutralization point is on that kind of a day. See, and every day is different. That's the wonderful part about it. There have never been 2 days alike, as far as the painter is concerned, since the beginning of time. Now, we can't quite get that finite in our thinking. But boy, the more change, the more consistent change we get into our pictures, the better off we are. Right now, that painting is not a how-to-do-it thing, and can't be taught that way. It's a point of view, a way of looking at things that all fine painters have always shared. You can tell the differences between all the fine painters by looking at their paintings. But their differences is not what made them great. The fact that Homer's paintings look different than George Inness or Corot, that Rembrandt's were different than Velázquez or Vermeer, and Rayburn's are different than all of them. The differences are not what made them great. It's what they shared in common. It's what they understood about nature and universal law that made them great. Their differences are just that they were different people, different personalities. They understood things in different ways. They liked different things. They were attracted to different things. We're after what all of them understood. And that's all that's worth studying, and it's all that's worth talking about. We're not interested in styles or fashions. We're not interested in being different for the sake of being different. If we make our own honest study of things that are true, our own handwriting will out. That's the only way we can be different, is to be ourselves, because we're different already. I have never diverted from my teacher, from what he taught me, ever, to the best of my ability. After all these years, I don't paint anything like him, because I'm not him. Sometimes I wish I did. Many times I wish I did. But I can't. My own handwriting has to be there for better or worse. Usually worse. Okay, let's get back to landscapes. Unlike the shadow, the sunlight does not get lighter or darker as it recedes into the distance. It simply loses its yellow. Now the whole earth is receding into the distance, just as the light revolves around the form, from yellow to red to violet. From yellow to green to blue-green to violet. They're your complements. If the sunlight did get lighter as it receded into the distance, there would be no silhouette of the earth against the sky. And that's the first thing you see when you look out of doors. The sky is the source of light on the earth. So suppose we averaged in the green part of our landscape on an average sunny day at cadmium yellow deep, and we want to make that green recede into the distance. We have to pull the yellow out of that green. So we have a gray right there on the palette that's supposed to be as dark as the green we started with in the foreground. If we add the gray to the green, without getting lighter or darker, it will recede right into the distance. And we said that a landscape is as good as its progression. We have to make that transition very consistently. When we add a gray to the green, what we're really adding to the green, besides itself, is red. Just simply, green is yellow and blue. Gray is yellow and blue and red. So that when we add a gray to a green, what we're adding to it besides itself is red. Finally, the influence of the sky does come to bear on the sunlight. As we approach the foreground, coming away from, say, the distant mountain, the sky cannot influence the sunlight at all. In fact, if your picture looks like the sky is influencing the sunlight, no sunlight. The sun is such a potent force that it blots out any influence that the sky might have on the sunlight. It's only the atmosphere, that obstruction in the air, that pulls the yellow out of the sunlight. On the other hand, it's both the sky and the atmosphere that destroy the shadow so rapidly. And the yellow in the sunlight lasts longer because it has the ability to, the power to penetrate the atmosphere and come back to your eye. While on the other hand, the shadows are negative and do not have that intensity to come back to the eye. They're easily destroyed. That's why on a clear day, a very bright, clear day, it's usually not as interesting to paint because that wonderful rapid progression isn't there. And when the more atmospheric the day gets, usually the more interesting the painting becomes, because the middle distance is sort of clouded over with atmosphere, and you get a dramatic difference from the foreground to the middle distance to the distance. All right, in the sunlight then, we have that triad, and we have a gray right there to take the top plane back into the atmosphere. And we've got another gray to take the side plane back into the atmosphere, that triad. That's the middle position, top plane, side plane. Got a gray and we'll go right back into the atmosphere. We said the sunlight does not get lighter or darker as it goes back into the atmosphere. Then we have our top plane, and that recedes off into the distance, into its own gray. And we have the side plane, the second side plane, so that we have 5 planes that recedes into the distance into its own gray. But the only one that doesn't change is the average of the sunlight. The top planes will fall toward the average, and the side planes will gradually disappear toward the average. When you look at a field in the foreground, you see the interstices, so that it averages darker and it has much more description the closer it gets to you. But you don't have to go very far away and those side planes disappear and all you're looking at is top planes. So that if you drew a graph of what's going on in the sunlight, it would look like a right angle, equilateral triangle, with the lights falling towards the middle, with the darks tending to disappear towards the middle. Finally, the blue gets into the sunlight. So what is all of the Earth doing? It's going from yellow, gradually getting redder. Finally, the sky comes in violet, yellow to red to violet. What are we doing when we go around the figure from yellow to red to violet? See how simple it is. These principles are natural laws and cannot change, ever. Most painters change them, and that's why there's so few fine paintings. You can go to any show, any place you want to go. You'll see very few pictures that are true to these principles. All the fine painters tried to consistently be faithful to the truth. That's why they're so convincing, and that's why people revere them so much. Let's say again, our purpose, highest purpose, is to bring the painting to life. There's no other way to do it. No amount of description or detail can do that. A lot of people think that that can be done, but it can't. if we drew a graph of what's going on in the shadow, we said that all the shadows are getting lighter rapidly as they recede into the distance, into both the sky and the atmosphere. This is the neutralization point. The darker the shadow is, the quicker it loses off. In other words, your darkest darks are the ones that lose off the fastest. They're destroyed the fastest. At the Met, if you can find 10 landscapes that have a consistent progression in them, I'll eat the rest of them. Isn't that something? So we have 5 planes in the shadow. We know how to progress them. We know that the colors in the foreground, in both, there's no other place to put your color. In both the light and the shadow. We know that they act differently. We know exactly how to handle it. Then there's another little dark in the foreground that we call a repoussoir. That's pronounced correctly. You go, repoussoir, you know. And that just happens in the foreground. It's an exceptional note. You always want to try to find one. And if you can't find one, dig a hole and stick one in anyway. Or put a rock in there and put a hole under the rock. Because that sort of pushes back the whole landscape. It only happens once. All right. Now the sky is doing this thing. Only the sky, the blue part of the sky, is a reverse progression. When you look up at the zenith, you're looking out into the blackness of space through the thinnest part of the atmosphere. And therefore, it's darker, and therefore it got redder. So the red's in the foreground, in the sky, at the zenith. As we look down the sky, we're looking into more and more sunlit-filled atmosphere. So the sky picks up yellow as it goes down. So at the zenith, we think of ultramarine blue, because that's the reddest blue. Then we slowly go towards cobalt. That's beginning to pick up a little bit of yellow. And we go towards manganese. That's picking up a little bit more yellow. Finally, the atmosphere gets so thick, we can't look out in the blackness of space at all. So we start to pick up a little red again towards the horizon. Find the way down at the horizon, violet. So we're going from yellow halfway down the sky and all that sunlit-filled atmosphere, from yellow to red to violet towards the zenith, and from yellow to red to violet down towards the horizon. It's also working from side to side, across the sky from side to side. The clouds in the sky are a straight progression. The sunlight on the clouds nearest the sun, MTU, are the yellowest in the sunlight parts. Even as you go across the top of the sky, you're picking up red because you're going away from the sun. You might go from yellow deep gradually towards orange at the top. And then from the top receding off into the distance, yellow to red to violet. Nothing else to do. Every cloud is doing that, and it never did anything else. It's also working around the sky from side to side, all the way around.
Is there any way these progressions are interrupted? Not so much the sky, but let's say you don't go any farther than, let's say, the middle distance, because you got a wall or a fence or something.
Without question. That's why the close-up paintings are difficult. It's difficult to gain experience in painting around here because there's so little places where you can see any distance. And your progressions are stopped just halfway. And most people, when they don't have the principle, will paint the end of the street the same values as the ones in the front, and the same color. so they have very little space in them. That's the way most street scenes in Rockport are painted. All those painters, they don't know about progression, so the darks and the color in the back is just as dark as it is in the front of the street. But even though it's that slight, it's there. And it's a funny thing, if you look at it upside down, you'll even be able to, you see the progression much better even down a quaint village street. When you're standing up and looking at it, they're so close you don't see them. So
You
when you-
physically bend over.
Yeah, look between your legs and you'll see them. One time I had a whole group of ladies out in the field, and a friend of mine came to see me here, and he got directions to where we were. And he walked into the field, and all the ladies like this. He would wonder what the hell's going on here? But it's amazing, you'll see the progression. You'll even see the loss of yellow in the sunlight. Okay. Now, on a gray day, you practically, there's less shadow and less light. You can walk around a tree. There's no shadow side of the tree. There are no cast shadows. The accents are still there, the holes. So there's less shadow. In other words, your shadow mass is averaging up lighter, and your lights are averaging down darker. So practically all you have to do is cut off the first two planes in the sunlight and put in planes in between, you know, deep, and deep, and orange. You still have 5 planes. They're closer together and richer, because we cut off the light and we cut off the darks on the average. So the whole picture is richer. So your gray day, nice, bright gray day is more colorful than a sunny day, because it's got more in the middle of the palette. We confuse richness and brightness. Sunny day has the brightness. The gray day has the richness. Towards, as the day wanes and we get into late afternoon, the light is getting a little redder, a little orangey. And the top plane becomes the upright plane. So the light's coming sideways, so the brightest lights are on the upright instead of on the flat plane or a slanting plane. Usually the top plane is a slanting plane, and gradually as the day wanes it becomes an upright plane. And then the sun goes down and the sky's shining up in the sky, and then you just have reflected sunlight from the clouds. During that whole transition through the day, the sky is getting darker, and the shadows are getting darker because the sky is carrying the less white light into the shadow. The clearer the day, the darker the sky, the darker the shadows get. So we're ready to move down a triad from red light, medium, deep, to medium, deep, and deep, deep. See, we're ready to change and shift our pitch to meet the different situations. To get down into moonlight. These 9 values will prevail even in a moonlight. Painters have always pitched their moonlights too dark. They're so anxious to get the moon in the sky that they make their landscapes black. Even Innes did that, practically black. But that's forcing. And no matter how hard you try, you can't paint the moon in the sky. We can paint it when it's covered, half covered over with a cloud, or where there's a lot of atmosphere. But the pitch of a bright moonlight night is much lighter than you think. Usually, you would never let a light get lighter than orange. It was a light on a white house, the value of orange. I swear I've seen moonlight nights on Mohican where it came up lighter than that. There's no smog and it's clear as a bell. You could read the numbers on the door, everything. The sky is just as prismatic on that moonlight night as it is on a sunny day. Yellow to red to violet, yellow to green to blue-green to violet. The green in the blue sky is sort of like terre-verte, a very violet-y, vague, bluey hint of green. The clouds, yellow to red to violet. Wonderful glow. Anna and I saw a sky on Mohican this year that was just fantastic. The whole prison was just a display of the rainbow all through the clouds. Now we've got to paint water too, and that is a mirror of the sky. The zenith reflects in the foreground water. And as you go back, and if it's smooth, go back in the water, you're going right down the sky, the distant sky and the distant water. Only it drops in pitch a little bit. If the wind blows, it changes the surface of the water, and it might reflect a brighter part of the sky. That's why you very often see streaks in the water, even when it's smooth. When you're painting a stream, in the foreground, as a stream, you can see through the water and see the bottom. So you're really painting the bottom. If the wind blows, it might change the surface of the water and it might reflect the sky. So you get a nice little horizontal streak that will put surface on the water. So in the foreground, you're looking through the water that way. And gradually, as you look back, you gradually can't see the bottom anymore because you're looking through the water this way. And then it becomes just a mirror of the sky or what's behind it as a reflection. The sunlight does not influence the water at all. It just goes right through it. If the water's dusty, it can get cast shadows on the dust and sunlight on the dust, but not the water. If there's a riffle and there's foam and disturbance, that's opaque. And the sunlight is brilliant sunlight, just like a burst of foam in the sea. That's opaque. The shadow part of the foam will reflect the sky very clearly, very blue-violet. All shadows are negative, let's say it again. So that whether they're blue or red or green or brown or whatever they are, they're relatively violet. All of your shadows are in a landscape and in a portrait are earth colors. We don't use the earth colors because they absorb moisture. And when the cadmiums get into the earth colors, they're not happy. There's all that moisture around. And they dry a little funny, they might fade and dull. Sometimes they crack. Sometimes they try to run away from each other and make funny little patterns of cracks. But most of our paintings are earth colors, but we make them. And we desperately want to keep our chemistry pure. An earth color is nothing but a color with violet in it. We have many different families of violets, from red violet to blue violet. When we start throwing the cadmiums into these violets, we get whole different families of earth colors. The earth colors are in the tube, that's just one family. There are many families of them. We can mix every single earth color that was ever put in a tube. But our chemistry is pure, and all the pigments are compatible with each other chemically. That's what we want. In all the years I've been painting, I've never seen a change in any painting and not one crack. That's good chemistry. And I don't know anything about chemistry, but the old man sure did. Sargent had very bad chemistry. His paintings are cracking to pieces. And he had a bad little habit of painting over another picture. And he'd do it too soon. He might be fairly safe if he waited a year or two until the paint was oxidized, and then paint over it. It would certainly last better, but there's no question that he painted on them too soon before they were oxidized. So then the top layer will oxidize before the first one. And as the bottom layer oxidizes, it grabs a hold of the top one and cracks it. The painter has a wonderful power to make the person who's looking at the picture look at it just the way he wants you to look at it. He would like to attract attention, for example, either to the right or the left of the foreground. He would like to attract attention across the center of the canvas and not let your eye go out, but attract attention on the other side to pull your eye across the center of the canvas a second time. Don't let the eye go out. Attract attention over here and pull the eye across the picture a third time. Wonderful S. It could be going around the other way. You force the person to look at the whole picture. Then let them go out. That's repose. You can look at that picture forever and you'll never tire of it. Most pictures are static. You won't be able to live with them long because you just look at it and it's flat, static. It's not moving. So it's not only the progression of the movement of the sky all around the horizon and from the horizon to the zenith of the blue part of the sky and the clouds moving and the landscape progressing from the foreground to the distance and from side to side. It's also the structure of your picture that you're responsible for. We know that God made the trees, but He didn't stick them in the right places all the time for a painter. You won't find very many ready-made compositions. You've got to compose what you're looking at. You don't just copy what you see. Another thing that will make a painting exciting and moving is a repetition of direction. And I find that by drawing a line from each corner to the center of the canvas, every one of them, if we follow those directions and make them important in the composition, don't mean always in a noticeable way. In fact, if you make that too obvious, it's obvious what you did. If you make that S too obvious, that's a bad thing. I frequently do that. You know what we've wound up with is the Jewish star. It's a curious thing how helpful those directions are. The only reason I can find is that you had a purpose in making those directions and you did it all over the canvas. And it makes a very interesting repetition in your picture. I've tried other schemes and they don't work half as well. I wish I could find the real reason why that is so effective, but I don't know. So we not only have to know what a light effect is, we know that it's a prismatic flow of light. We know that every fine painter contains that flow, and that every bad picture does not. That's saying something. But if we know what we are about, and if we know what we are trying to achieve with a lot of effort and love, we might have a good chance of getting there. And that's why I think it's so worthwhile that we put an awful lot of effort into this work. And that's all I know, and I think we might as well close it off now. Okay? Are there any more questions?
We gotta digest all of this first. The only thing that's confusing to me is that sky where it didn't go from the bottom to the top. It was like a point where you lost the yellow from the center up from the center down.
They're all, we're dealing, anything can happen in nature, except that principle is never violated, never. So you can't. Now, storms can come up and different crazy things can come in the sky that you can't explain. I saw a lot of things on this last trip that I was dumbfounded. I couldn't explain it. But there is an explanation if you could find it. And I can't find an explanation to everything, especially things that go on in the sky.
When I was in the service, I was over in the Philippines, and they used to burn their sugarcane patches. And they put an incredible amount of debris up in the air. They used to burn the leaves off so they could harvest it. And I've seen skies up there that were absolutely lavender purple. The whole thing was just suffused, and there's all those little particles in it.
Anything can happen, and trying to live up to something bigger than you are shouldn't inhibit you in any way. We're ready to try anything. Because we know anything can happen. We just got to prove that it could happen. If you put something crazy in the picture, maybe you can find some way, and it looks good, and you like it. You got to find some way of proving that it could happen. A lot of times things happen by accident. You don't know how the heck that happened. But in the main, a painter knows exactly what's going on. And if fortunate accidents happen, boy, it just...
That makes your day.
Yeah. But a good painter can make fortunate accidents happen.
More consistently than
Yeah,
one who isn't
yeah.
a good painter.
Especially in watercolor, those fellows who can really handle it, they can make those washes run around in ways they don't know how the hell happen, but it happened. And the good ones make it happen often. But you'll find that it's awful hard to get down to fundamental principles in watercolor. You're much better off to learn to paint in oils, because nothing happens unless you make it happen. You can hardly paint a watercolor that isn't colorful, just by the nature of the paint, because you're not looking at paint. The light goes right through the wash, hits the white paper, and comes back through the paint. You're looking at transmitted light. The whole damn thing is going. So it's so elusive, accidental, delightful, airy, colorful, spontaneous, accidental, everything, all those adjectives, that you have a hell of a job of learning how to paint in watercolor. You should learn to paint in oils, and if you want to paint in watercolor, just learn the technique. That's all there is to it. You'll find very few painters who learn to paint in watercolor who paint a light effect. Because they never went through the job of finding out what it was. And the medium is so tricky and elusive that you don't get down that little accents, Controlled accents.
Is there a way of using this approach and getting, let's say, to a certain point, and then maybe getting into glazes to finish? Or is that a
You don't have
no-no?
to. We want to paint directly. All the old masters had to glaze. Of course, you can do anything you want to do. It's a free country. I think a painting looks much better when it's fresh and direct. And you can see the strokes. And you knew what you're doing. You put it down, and that's it. You paint the picture once. Glazing implies painting it several times. We'd rather just to the best of our ability. If you goofed it up for some reason, you might find many reasons to glaze. You overdid the stream, for example. You can see the rocks on the bottom too much, or you see this or that too much. So then you put a glaze, a turbot over it, and quiet it all down. Well, you corrected, part of the picture that you overdid. But we don't have to glaze. If you want to paint that way, I think it takes the joy out of painting.
Was it the plan?
If it has to be in a set of stages, fully, I want to paint it, that's it. Okay.
Paint, paint, that's the only way.
Let this, when you're sleeping, right, you absorb it at night in your alpha state or beta state or whatever.